QSO Today, episode 327, Stan Johnson, W0SJ. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver and their new ID52A dual-band portable. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, W0SJ, your host. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo team has already begun to prepare for the next QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming in March of 2021. If you'd like to be a speaker or an exhibitor in the expo, please contact me. There is buttons in the show notes page. The expo is offering a significant discount to ham clubs, podcasters, YouTubers, and ham organizations who may want a booth on the exhibit floor. Please be in touch with me if you are interested. Stan Johnson, W0SJ, started his ham radio career in high school. A scavenger of junk and a kid with a knack led Stan to electronic project building with his collected parts, his skills filtered through the Air Force and the Bell Telephone Laboratories. Stan would say that this resulted in a life of curious exploration driven by amateur radio. W0SJ is my QSO Today. W0SJ, this is Eric, W0SJ. Are you there, Stan?
Yes, I am. How are you this afternoon?
I am great, Stan. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast, Stan. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I think that the earliest experience that I had that I would actually call a ham radio experience would have been when I was in the 6th or 7th grade of school. The school that I attended was very small, and the high school and the grade school was all in the same building. And the coat racks for the grade school kids was outside the room that the physics classes were taught in. And at the end of the day, when class was over for me, I would stand in the doorway and watch the lectures in the physics class. Well, the physics teacher was a single guy who was really glad to have somebody that was interested. And so after school, I would go in the classroom there and experiment with some of the stuff that they had. One of the things that they had was blocks of wood with electrical components mounted on them and fan stock clips, and so you could wire together various circuits. Well, this was a lot of fun, so I built up my own kit that was about the same, using parts that I'd scrounged out of broken radios and tubes and so forth. And that's one of the ways I would entertain myself. That was my favorite toy when I was in grade school.
What was the hometown?
Hometown was Ridgway, Iowa. At the time, it had a population of about 300.
And do you remember the name of the high school, middle school, elementary school?
It didn't even have a name. Listen, my hometown was so small, we only had one city limit. Yeah, it had Welcome to Ridgway on both sides of the sign.
Okay, so what happened after that?
Well, one summer, I built up a radio receiver using this kit. It had a 6SN7 in it, a 6V6, and so I had a 2-tube radio, and I thought, I wonder what would happen if I wound some wire around a pencil and replaced the coil that was in it with this homemade coil. So I did. Hooked it to my outside antenna and tuned around a little bit, and lo and behold, I heard the voices coming out of this that said, this is, and it gave a call sign, New Zealand, broadcasting to the North American continent on, I think it was 11.7 megahertz. They said megacycles because that was back in the old days. The following program will be in the English language, and I couldn't believe my ears. With this homemade radio receiver, I was picking up New Zealand. That was an amazing thing to me, and that's probably the first real ham radio experience, because I then realized that you could hear all over the world if you're tuning on the right frequencies. Well, when I went to high school, the sophomore year of high school, they closed the school in my hometown, and we had to ride the bus to Cresco, Iowa. And in Cresco, Iowa, the chemistry and physics teacher was a ham radio operator. His call was W0CYY, and his name was Bud Weatherford, and he inspired many, many people to get their ham radio license.
So he was your first Elmer. You were a sophomore in high school when you began studying. Did you get it the same year?
Yes. That was a novice license, and my novice license came November 11th of 1961.
And do you remember the call sign?
Oh, yes. My original call sign was W0AQC. I borrowed a receiver from a friend of mine. It was an S38D, and I cashed a bond that had been given to me when I was born, and that gave me $25. I bought a Globe Chief 90 kit from a ham radio store that was in Rochester, Minnesota, put the Globe Chief 90 together, and that's how I got on the air.
The Globe Chief was made by which company?
That was made by Globe, and I think it was made out of Council Bluffs or Omaha, somewhere over there. I don't remember for sure where they were made. They were distributed by World Radio Laboratories out of Council Bluffs. That was a long time ago.
That was your novice rig, right?
Well, it went past the novice. Then I got my conditional license and wanted to get on AM. I needed a modulator, an AM modulator, and so I built a modulator out of the handbook or someplace like that, and I didn't have an audio transformer or a modulation transformer to use with it. So I used two power transformers back to back. I had a pair of 1625s driving the high voltage side of one power transformer, hooked the 120 volt side to the second transformer's 120 volt winding, and then used the high voltage side of the second transformer to modulate the transmitter. And it worked. Surprisingly enough, it worked. I had all the parts that I needed in the junk box and didn't have to buy anything to build that.
Well, Stan, it seems to me that you just had a knack for this and weren't afraid to experiment and try it out.
Well, necessity is the mother of invention. And, when you're a high school student, you don't have a lot of money to go buy the fancy radios.
Do you think that is actually one of the keys to innovation, is having a limited budget?
Yeah, that is very well. The other is a lot of curiosity. What can I do? Can I build this? Can I make it work? I had a borrowed microphone too. It was borrowed from the high school. We had a club station there at the high school. That was W0CBJ, Charlie Victor Japan.
That was like Cresco.
Yes.
Something CBJ. Was it a vanity call sign, or it just happens to be that's what they got?
No, that was long before the days of the vanity call signs. That was a naturally occurring call sign, and as a joke for phonetics, we used Cresco's Vicious Juveniles.
Do you think that amateur radio clubs were important to your ham radio development?
Oh, especially the club in high school. That's where we learned a lot, and actually, Bud taught a class in electronics, and out of that class, people would get their ham radio licenses. So many, many, many people got their ham radio licenses through W0CYY, Bud Weatherford.
And about the time that you were in high school there, how many ham students were there?
Oh, boy. I would say all totaled, there was maybe 20-some hams that got their licenses through the school.
That seems pretty amazing, actually. That's probably the highest number in 327 episodes that I've recorded. That's really quite a testament to Bud Weatherford. Yeah,
he was quite a guy.
And so you upgraded in high school, like within the year? At that time, did the novice license only last a year, so you actually had to upgrade?
Yes, the novice license only lasted a year, and my code speed was up to 13, so I went and took the test to get the conditional license. Then in 1968, when incentive licensing came along, I drove up to Minneapolis in August and got my extra class license up there at the FCC office.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Yeah, I think it did. It gave me enough knowledge of electronics that when I enlisted in the Air Force back in 1963, I was able to go to electronics school to study airborne navigation and radar equipment and spend my time in the Air Force repairing what were called TACAN sets.
Which was some kind of navigation set for airplanes, right?
Yes. It sent out pulses and received signals from receivers on the ground, and it was effective out to about 200 miles at the time. The thing about TACANs, the unit was almost all tubes. They were the little pencil tubes, and they were soldered in. So you couldn't troubleshoot this thing just by pulling out the tubes and putting them in a tube tester. You had to get in there with a scope and look at the waveforms and the timing to see what had gone wrong. And so it gave me a tremendous amount of experience troubleshooting. And that, of course, came in handy later on in building things.
Now, was equipment like that for the Air Force, was that built so that you could actually pull it apart and troubleshoot it? It was relatively easy to troubleshoot?
It had plug-in modules, and you could set these modules on extenders to be able to get at them with the scope probes. It was a nightmare to troubleshoot. Most people avoided them, and I was fortunate to have a mentor there that worked on them, and so I learned that set. And so I ended up, almost all my time was spent working on TACANs. I never worked on any of the other equipment in the shop. And it was kind of nice because if you could repair TACANs, the shop chief considered you a very valuable resource because it made him look good, and you were kind of taken care of.
So you weren't like headed off to the infantry?
No. I was after getting out of tech school, I was stationed at Lincoln Air Force Base in Lincoln, Nebraska, where we had B-47s. And then I went from there to Stephenville, Newfoundland, where we had the KC-97 refueling tankers. And from there in 1966, I ended up going down to the base just south of Nashville, Tennessee, where we had C-130s.
This is your first two assignments. These were part of the Strategic Air Command?
Yes. I was in the Strategic Air Command for the first two assignments and the Tactical Air Command for the last assignment.
Were you an active ham radio operator when you were in the Air Force? And were there other hams there with you? Yes.
At Keesler Air Force Base, Mississippi, where the electronics schools were, we had a very large ham club, maybe 40 people in it, had a station set up in one of the buildings, and it was really a great time. There was a lot of ham radio camaraderie there.
And so did you have a station on the base, or if you did, was it like maybe an Air Force Mars station?
Well, we had some club equipment, but for the most part, the facility we had was large enough, and there were desks there. Everybody could have a desk to set up their own equipment on. Then we had cables running from a patch panel to all the desks, and you could come in there and operate your own equipment. I was fortunate enough to acquire a Drake TR-3 when I was in the Air Force, and so that's what I operated from Biloxi, Mississippi.
Now, with all the other hams there with their equipment on the desks, did that also give you an opportunity to try using other people's equipment as well?
Well, yeah, the opportunity was there, but most of us really didn't go fooling with other people's equipment.
Under their tutelage, perhaps?
Yeah, it happened some, but not a great deal.
So what happened after the Air Force? Were you a career Air Force guy, or did you just do your stint and then...
No, that was during the Vietnam War, and being in the military was not a good place to be. So I got out in 1967, and because of the electronics training I'd had in the Air Force and so forth, I got a job working for IBM as a field engineer. So I worked part-time for IBM in Nashville while I was still in the Air Force, and then I worked for IBM in Milwaukee till 1968. That was working on IBM 360 computers, which are now pretty obsolete and gone. But it was also an interesting thing to do.
For people that don't remember the IBM 360, as I recall, it took a very large area, like an entire air-conditioned room, right?
Yes, they were big. They took up a lot of space. And it was put in production a little too soon. We had an awful lot of engineering changes on them, modifications to solve problems, and that really made for a lot of overtime when I worked there in Milwaukee.
And now this message from ICOM America. Ham for the holidays. ICOM's new ID52A and IC705 give hours of fun and enjoyment working your favorite bands this holiday season. ICOM's newest handheld amateur radio is the ID52A. The ID52A is a larger radio with a larger color display and louder audio. This VHF-UHF digital transceiver is much more than a replacement for the ID51A, but it also is a new way of communicating. The color display is 2.3 inches for exceptional viewability, and the audio is 80% louder. This multifunction dual-band D-Star transceiver supports DR mode for easy access to local repeaters based on internal GPS information as well as terminal access point modes. The ID52A has Bluetooth for audio and data control, providing improved mobility and control. And for the first time in amateur radio industry, you can now send photos from a connected Android device. Other features include wideband receiver with guaranteed ranges of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It has a VV, UU, VU, and dual DV mode. Integrated GPS receiver, including grid square location. Micro SD card slot. Micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging. And it's IPX7 waterproof. The ID52A is the perfect companion to the IC705. Both use compatible batteries and headsets, and you can also use the same Android app for D-Store operation. The IC705 is the perfect sidekick to the ID52A for hams that like to enjoy what both the great indoors and outdoors have to offer. This is the perfect QRP companion, base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. Other features include 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, 5 watts out with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with 13.8 volts DC supplied. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions, touchscreen display, micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN. Integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot, speaker microphone. The HM243 comes standard. Supports QRP and QRPP operations. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is, of course, the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 and room for accessories for soda activations or a day of social distancing in the park. The IC705 is now shipping. Follow the link in the ICOM banner ad in this week's show notes, or go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur for more information on these fine rigs. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO. Now I remember the IBM field engineers would show up on site in their suit and tie.
Yes.
They would take the jacket off and crawl inside the machine. Was that kind of what you were doing?
Yes. Yes. It was, one of the things that happened to me when I was crawling inside the machine is I had all the paperwork laying out on the floor and the soldering iron and all that, and I was kind of leaning back into the machine. My foot slipped on the floor, and it pushed the soldering iron into the paperwork that I had and started it on fire. And I got a lot of teasing about that. Yeah, old Stan, he's so good that when he goes to do a job, the first thing he does is burn the instructions.
Didn't need them because you already had the knack.
Well, I got the fire put out before it destroyed any part of the instructions I needed. It just, a couple sheets of paper. And
Stan, how did you spend the rest of your career? How long were you at IBM?
I was only at IBM for about a year and a half. Then they passed the GI Bill, which would give me money to go to college. So I left IBM and went to Iowa State University. Oh, that was fabulous there. I just enjoyed learning electronics there. It was the greatest years of my life.
So you got a BSCE?
What I have is a little different from that. They had a special program because there was a tremendous shortage of engineers at the time. They had a special program where you could go in and take nothing but engineering classes. There was no requirements for general education stuff. And so every class I had was physics, mathematics, electronics, with the exception of one class on public speaking and one class on technical writing.
What did they call that degree?
Well, at the time, they called it an associate's degree, but now we have all these junior colleges cranking out associate's degrees, that it has diminished the value of Iowa State University's program. It diminished the value and the perception. We had stuff in our program that people in the normal two-year colleges never hear about. So it was different, it was unique, and it was terrific. I had a lot of good memories from there.
Doesn't Iowa State also have a football team?
They do, but I'm not into sports. I have no athletic ability, and so I really don't pay any attention to sports.
Well, the truth is, neither do I. I'm flat-footed, and so therefore I was never for sports where I actually had to use my feet.
Okay.
So, Stan, what happened after that?
Well, I left Iowa State, and I had planned to go back to IBM. I'd interviewed at their plant in Rochester, Minnesota, and they had a job offer for me in the outbasket of the secretary's desk when IBM declared their employment freeze of 1970. They went all the way to a vice presidential level to try to get approval to hire me back, and the vice president says, no, if we do it for one, we got to do it for all. And so I did not get to go back to IBM. Now, as you look at how IBM has gone downhill as a company, that was one of the best things that ever happened to me, I think. So what I ended up doing was going to work for a place called Bell Telephone Laboratories in Naperville, Illinois. And that was an incredible place to work. That was absolutely incredible. I was there, and we had a ham radio club. The labs had funded equipment for us. We had a Drake line there. Got to know lots of ham radio operators. But what an environment for people that just like to create things. They had a policy that if you wanted to build something, and we've got parts here in the inventory, just go ahead and use parts, because what you will learn is more valuable than any parts that you could get out of our stockroom. And so we had wonderful opportunities to build things and fraternize with incredibly smart people. The boss that I had at Bell Labs had transferred there at the company's request from out east, and he knew Shockley, Bratton, and Bardeen, the inventors of the transistor.
So I was going to ask you about that. When I think of the Bell Labs or the Bell Telephone Laboratories, I think about the New Jersey branch, because most of the people that I've interviewed that used to work there worked in New Jersey.
Yes, yeah. That's where most of the labs were, but they had one. It was called the Indian Hills Lab, and it was in Naperville, Illinois.
What kind of innovations came out of the Illinois Bell Labs?
Well, what we designed and built there that I was involved with was called the number 4 ESS switcher. We couldn't call them computers because of the consent decree. IBM got to build computers. We had to build switchers. It handled all of the long-distance switching in the system. There was I think about 20 of them installed overall. It was an interesting place to work. One of the things that you had there was an attitude of publish or perish. And so while I was there, I published an article in Ham Radio Magazine on an automatic antenna tuner for mobile operation. What the problem was with an 80-meter mobile antenna, you had a very narrow bandwidth, only about 10 kilohertz or so. And what I did is I tuned the antenna to the low end of the range I wanted to operate, had a variable capacitor that then just canceled out some of the inductive reactance, and it gave you about 100 kilohertz bandwidth off your mobile antenna. That was published in Ham Radio, I think, about 1974.
What was your call sign then?
At that time, it was still W0SJ.
So I'll see if I can find that article for the show notes page. I think any of us that were interested in Bell telephone systems in those days remember the number 4 ESS and the various devices that were used to control them from a consumer line.
Yeah, it was a really an interesting place to work with a lot of fascinating people to work with. Some of them were quite eccentric.
I think that kind of goes with the territory. And how long were you there at the labs?
I was there for 3.5 years. My wife and I both wanted to move back to Iowa and get out of the big city environment. You know, it's much better now because of the anti-pollution stuff on vehicles. But when we would drive back to the Chicago area after being back in Iowa for the weekend or something like that, you could see this big greenish-gray dome over the area on the horizon, and we'd say, we live under that? It was a high-cost place to live. It was crowded, and we just didn't want to stay there. So we moved in March of 74 back to Iowa, and in the fall of 74, the government decided to break up AT&T, and Bell Labs was virtually destroyed. I went back a year later to visit old friends, and they all said to me, man, you got out of here just in time.
Yeah, that was really too bad. That was the Carter Phone Act, I think.
Yeah, I don't remember anymore. Too long ago.
They broke the Bell system into, 7 operating companies?
Yeah, and left Bell Labs out hanging with no visible means of support.
It was too bad for the labs. I kind of remember as a kid who was interested in phones, obviously it was liberating to be able to connect your own stuff to the line now, but I do remember when the phone man would come and they were experts at running wire around your stucco house and through the wall, and they'd plant the phone there, and the phone was there. It didn't move. You couldn't unplug it and move it to some other place in the house. I remember that time really well. So what did you end up doing in Iowa?
Well, I ended up working for John Deere at their product engineering center. And that was a really good place to work when I came there. It was wonderful. And I had a chance to do some very interesting things there.
So for us city slickers who think of John Deere as a tractor company, what does John Deere need a Bell Labs experienced electronic engineer for?
The two things that I worked on that resulted in a couple of patents and so forth were an automatic... Okay, are you familiar with forage harvesters?
I'm not familiar with harvesters at all. There may be a number of listeners that are listening that know all about this stuff, but I'm a city slicker, and probably a lot of city slickers have no idea what a harvester is.
Okay, well, if you're in the beef or dairy industry, you need to take your corn or your hay and chop it up, make silage out of it. So these machines will go through a cornfield, they'll cut off the entire stalk and chop it up. And the big ones that are available today will chop an amazing amount. They'll fill a semi-truck full of chopped up corn in just a matter of a couple of minutes. Well, there's a problem, especially in Europe, and that is if there's metal laying in the field, it gets into the cutter head, it can cause damage, and it can give the cows hardware disease. And the other thing is that you have to stop periodically to sharpen the knives on this big rotating drum that cuts the corn up into little pieces. I developed an automatic knife sharpener and shear bar adjusting system using automotive knock sensors. So all the our operator has to do is basically push buttons, and it'll take care of itself. It saves a lot of time. And then, as far as the tramp metal is concerned, we had a metal detector on there that was made using two coils, and it produced a lack of sensitivity right in the middle between the two coils. I came up with an idea for the metal detector that used three coils, and not only did it eliminate the gap in the sensitivity curve, but it also could tell if your tramp metal was on the left side of the material in the center or on the right-hand side, which helped the farmer find that piece of metal. A lot of times it'll just be a piece of old baling wire, but sometimes you'd pick up something like a hammer that had fallen off a wagon at some point in time, and those can really cause some damage. And of course, in Europe, it has been heard that occasionally they pick up bomb fragments. So having a metal detector on your machine to protect both the cows and the machine was really something that was highly desirable by the farmers.
So it would stop the harvester and you'd have to get out and find the metal thing and remove it.
Yes. This machine is moving the corn in at such a high rate of speed that you have only about 100 milliseconds from the time you detect that metal to where you have to have that machine completely stopped. So it had some challenges.
These tractors, these harvesters, are actually quite sophisticated.
Yes, they are.
I would imagine that nowadays they practically are self-driving.
Well, they're working at it. But I've been retired now for over 19 years, so I've lost track of what the latest and greatest is. When I worked on them, they were at the 6000 series, and now they're at the 9000 series. So there's been a lot happen while I've been gone.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Jeremy, KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker, VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. So let's talk a little bit about ham radio then, because we've come through your professional life to where you are now. What's the current rig there?
Well, currently I'm running an ICOM 7300. I sent you a picture this morning, or last night. And hopefully it will be good enough to make use of.
I'll find it and it will be in the show notes.
And I also have an old ICOM 765. I've got a KX3 and an ICOM 7000. But the rigs that I'm really interested in is one that I'm working on just building out of junk parts. I have a receiver that just needs a local oscillator built up, and then I plan or hope to this winter build a transmitter to go with it. It's just going to be CW, probably on the QRP frequencies, but one of my goals is to make a contact where I've completely built the entire station out of junk.
Well, I noticed your email address includes the words scavenge as junk.
That's the phonetics for W0SJ.
Oh, I thought that was Stan Johnson.
Yeah, it could be, but it helped me to remember my name.
What kind of junk do you scavenge, and when did the habit of scavenging begin?
It's happened way back on that first radio that I built way back when I was in grade school. I've been building things out of junk my whole life, and it just adds to the fun. Anybody can go out and buy an appliance, or you can go buy a kit. But what's really fun and challenging is to build something out of stuff that other people have thrown away.
I absolutely agree. My wife will tell you that there's an attic and a basement full of junk. Tell me, what kind of junk do you look for? Obviously electronic junk, but what kind of junk do you look for and where do you find it?
That's mostly the electronic stuff. I have stuff. I dragged home an old console stereo that was just set out on the street, and it had tubes in it. I gutted the parts out of it, and I used the transformers in there to build an audio amplifier. So I have my own audio amplifier built out of junk, and I hope to build some more of them here this winter.
It seems to me, because I've heard this on other podcasts, that having an audio amplifier is really the first best thing to build, because once you have it on your bench, then you can plug anything into it. Would you go along with that philosophy?
Well, this isn't a bench type of audio amplifier. It's for a hi-fi stereo. And the distortion on it is so low that it can just barely be measured. It's about 90 dB down.
I guess what I was thinking when I said on the bench, it would be really cool to have an amplifier like that on your ham radio bench or in your station, that you could just actually take the output of other things and run it into that and have just a nice, beautiful amplifier.
Yeah, you're right. But most of the time I work FT8 anymore, and so I don't really make use of an audio amplifier.
It seems to me, given the rigs that you have, although it seems to me the 7300 is probably ideal for FT8.
Yes, it is.
You went from being a CW operator, or are you still a CW operator?
Back in the olden days, I worked a lot of CW, and then my wife says, why don't you talk to him instead so I can hear too? And so I kind of drifted away from CW, and right now my code is pretty rusty. But I want to try to get that back again too, so I can use my homebrew transmitter and receiver when I get it finished.
What do you like about FT8?
Oh, I can work DX all over the place, and it's easy.
So for you, the sunspot, being low in the cycle on sunspots, has not really affected your operation with FT8?
No, I've been, the bands are kind of weird sometimes, but I have worked on 160 meters, Japan, Australia, several Europeans, and I think South Africa. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but that's on 160. On 80 meters, I worked a lot of DX stations also. You just get on about midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning and track the gray line. That also helps. And you track the gray line, and you can work a lot of DX.
So when do people find you on the air? Are you an early to rise kind of guy?
Usually about 11:30 till 1 o'clock in the morning is when I'm working on the air.
Really? Well, that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I'm...
You're a night owl.
Somewhat of a night owl, yes.
Do you have any favorite bands on FT8, or do you just kind of see what's open and then that's where you go work?
If it's open, I like working 30 meters.
And why do you like 30 meters? I've actually had other people say that as well, that there's something about 30 meters that seems to be more interesting than other bands. Why 30 meters?
It's a great band. It's not as crowded. And it just has really good characteristics. A lot of DX shows up on 30-meter FT8.
What's the antenna situation there?
I live on a fairly narrow lot. It's 54 feet wide. I suppose I should state that in meters. 200 feet deep. If I were into gardening, it would be great for growing spaghetti. But it's long and narrow, and I've got good neighbors. So for antennas for 160 meters, I go up the tower, and then I go out about 100 feet. And at the bottom of the tower, I have a network of capacitors and coil so that it is converted to 50 ohms. And that's what I work on 160. Now, the advantage of having the tuning network at the bottom of the tower is if I have a failure, I don't have to get a bucket truck in here to go up to the top of the tower and fool with it. I have the minimum amount of stuff at the top of the tower. For 80 meters and 75 meters, I have two separate antennas. My 80-meter antenna is an end-fed long wire. It comes from the top of the garage roof, goes up the tower, through an insulator, and then down to the neighbor's garage. And on the end, it's fed with a coil. There is 24 turns of wire, 2.5 inches in diameter, tapped 4 turns up from the bottom, and it will feed an impedance of about 1,800 ohms. There's a 6-to-1 turns ratio, or a 36-to-1 impedance ratio, so it reaches a much higher impedance than I can with the 9-to-1 ununs. And that antenna really works out well for DX on 80 meters. For 75, I've just got a center-fed dipole, and it is too close to the ground, but it's more for local contacts anyway, so I don't worry about the pattern of it. 40 meters, I've got a vertical, homebrew vertical, and fed with a 9-to-1 unun, and an inverted V up on the tower. Now, the vertical antenna is 44 feet of aluminum going up. The bottom of the antenna is about 10 feet off the ground, and it's fed to a 9-to-1 unun, and it works very well from 40 meters up through 10. But on 10 meters, it doesn't have a real good pattern, so I really don't use it there. I use the beam instead. So I've got an old KL MKT34A at the top of the tower for a beam.
In other words, that 40-meter vertical is an end-fed antenna with the 9-to-1 unun on it.
Yes.
You don't have a counterpoise then, or much of a counterpoise. You're using the coax.
The outside of the braid of the coax is running about 10 feet above ground, and it acts as the other half of the antenna. There's about 130 feet of coax on there, and it just works out really well.
What kind of power do you operate?
Well, most of the time, just 100 watts. I do have, you'll see in the picture, there's an Elecraft amplifier that's 500 watts. It's a very good amplifier. If I'm not being heard well, I'll kick it on. But it's just for situations where I'm not getting through.
You mentioned that you've got the KX3, the Elecraft KX3, which is kind of a field rig, a portable rig. Do you operate in the field? Are you like a SOTA guy?
Well, I had intentions of doing that, and it was a good plan, but it never really panned out. I've had some health problems that really kind of restricted me from going out and playing operate from the woods.
From Iowa, I would imagine that for SOTA, you'd have a hard time finding mountains.
We don't have any mountains to speak of, but we do have some really pretty hills.
Which would be okay for SOTA contacts?
Well, it's something I never really got into, so I never even really tried going out. But if you get up around the northeast corner of the state, we have an area, it's called the Driftless area. It was never covered by glaciers in the last ice age. And so you have a lot of very scenic hills and streams, and it's just a very pretty part of the country.
Earlier you were talking about the unun on your 40-meter vertical. We hear on podcasts and probably on discussion groups about balons and ununs, and you wrote an article about your 9-to-1 unun for the March 2019 QST. What's the difference between a balun and an unun, and where would you use either one?
Well, the balun is a balanced output, and you'd use it in the center of your antennas. The unun is unbalanced. One side of it is connected to the shield of the coax, and so you'll use that in end-fed antennas.
So an unun is an end-fed antenna device?
Yes.
In this particular case, if you use an unun in an end-fed antenna, unless you've got a wire counterpoise that's maybe coming off of the shield portion of the SO239 connector, then the coax is being used as the counterpoise.
Yes.
Do you use any toroids or anything like that to block RF currents from coming into the shack then?
Yes, I do. I've got 3 or 4 clamp-on big ferrite beads outside, just before the coax comes into the house. And it works really quite well.
How many FT8 contacts do you think you've made with this whole setup?
Oh, at the moment, I think I'm somewhere around 2,000.
I saw that you are the expert in your radio club about winter preparations. Now, I happen to live in the desert, so it doesn't look like I've got a lot of winter preparations that I'm going to have to make because I don't have any trees. But in your case, you happen to be where you could have ice or snow or trees. What would you recommend to listeners who might be in a climate that has snow and ice, how they should get ready for winter?
Well, the old saying around here is if your antenna stays up through the winter, it's too small. The thing that I tell people is to try to make their antennas accessible so they don't have to get a bucket truck in to repair them. I had my coax one time that went up to the beam freeze and actually break in two one January. So it's you want to try to keep good stuff up in the air where it's hard to get at. I had to wait until March before we could even get in here with a bucket lift because of the snow piled up around the tower. But in spite of some of the difficulties of Iowa's climate, we have another saying. It's really great because it keeps the tourists away.
So what do you do at the top of the tower? I mean, did you eliminate the connectors at the top of the tower? If you're trying to avoid having to go to the top of the tower, is there some way that you might prepare your antenna site different than maybe a traditional way?
Yes. Okay, I have an insulator at the top of the tower, which is holding the center of the 80-meter antenna. And the wire is only fed through the hole in the insulator. If I have a problem where I have to pull part of the wire down, I can disconnect the wire from either end, where it's just up on the garage roof and easy to get at, and I can slide it through the insulator to access the place on the wire that I need to get. The only thing at the top of the tower that may require maintenance is the rotor for the beam. Everything else is on the ground.
That sounds like an interesting article or presentation that should be made, right?
Well, I don't know. It's probably too short to ever make into a presentation because there's not much there, just about half a dozen sentences at most.
Maybe there's like a design philosophy. I remember as a young man not being afraid to climb towers no matter how high they were, with equipment that was probably questionable at best because I was young and dumb and stupid. But now that I'm older, I don't really want to climb on the roof, for example, even though it's 4 stories above the ground. It's high enough that if I don't die, I'm going to be in pain for the rest of my life. So it seems to me that there should be maybe a design philosophy for getting towers in the air or getting antennas in the air that allow you to do the maintenance from the ground. I guess tiltovers is a way, or crank-ups is also a way. But maybe there's something in terms of, let's say in the winter you can't crank it down, but you want to avoid hardware at the top of the tower that potentially can freeze and crack. Is that a design philosophy that could be explored and elaborated on in order to be able to create something that is serviceable from the ground?
Well, when I did the vertical antenna, I did that. If I want to lower my vertical antenna, I loosen one nut and I loosen one guy rope, and I've got a boat winch on there, and I can crank the vertical down to where I can reach the entire antenna for doing any kind of repair or modifications. And it can be done by one person.
That vertical antenna is what, nested aluminum tubing?
Yes, and it pivots on a hinge that's used for a farm gate. I've got a 4x6 treated lumber post in the ground, and I got a boat winch that I use to raise and lower it.
It would be interesting to see, and maybe you can take a picture and we'll put in the show notes, of how that winch and that cable is used to actually raise and lower nested aluminum tubing.
Yeah, I may have a picture on the phone here already that I could send you, but I'm afraid I'd drop the call if I go exploring here looking for a picture.
It sounds to me like that's an interesting project, and it seems to me that's something you've thought about. Obviously, you also don't want to climb the tower, even in winter, Going on the roof is probably not your favorite idea, even in winter. So it's very interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing more on that in the future.
The climbing on the roof in the wintertime is not good because if it's really cold, you'll crack the shingles, and you don't want to crack your shingles.
Because you don't want the winter inside your house.
Right. It's... I used to climb this tower. I used to climb the tower just for exercise, go up and down it. And now I've sold my climbing belt, and I've had knee surgery, and I'm not going up that tower anymore.
A bucket truck is the best way to service that tower now.
Yep, and that's $150 minimum.
Do you run into people that when you tell them you're an amateur radio operator, that they're kind of puzzled and they think, do people still do that?
Not really. I don't run into that many people. Now that I'm retired, I don't have that large a circle that I travel in. It's all the hams that I know in the area are kind of the ones I spend my time with.
And it seems to me the general public around you, at least your neighbors, seem to have a nice disposition towards amateur radio if they're going to let you use the roof of their garage for the end of your wire.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate. Iowa is, I live in an old-fashioned neighborhood, and everybody knows everybody kind of, and helps each other out and gets along, and it's just different from the big city life.
What excites you the most about amateur radio now?
When I build something and it works, that's exciting.
What is the most complex project that you've done, that you've built from junk that you've scrounged up?
Well, probably this receiver that I've got. It's got two 500 hertz crystal filters in it in tandem, and it's got a sensitivity of minus 130 dB. It's just I'm using a signal generator for the local oscillator, and I've got to get something built up there to finish the receiver. It's probably the most complicated thing I have another project in the works, and that's an automatic antenna tuner. I've had a lot of frustration out of antenna tuners that are sold. I've watched two of them blow up, and I have pretty mediocre regard for most of the automatic antenna tuners I've seen. So I built my own antenna tuner, and now the prototype works fine, and now I'm rebuilding it so it looks pretty. Uses a roller inductor and a variable capacitor, and it works. But it's not finished yet. When I get it finished, maybe I'll publish it. I don't know.
It's an automatic antenna tuner, so you're going to use something like an Arduino or something like that to control the...
I don't have an Arduino in it. Maybe could, but when I build things, I try to design them in a way that people can duplicate what I've designed without having to be overwhelmed by the complexity. And so this thing uses CMOS gates and pretty well takes care of itself. And if you look at the schematic of it, you'll say, well, anybody can build that. And that's, as soon as I say, well, here, but it requires an Arduino, half the hams I know would not touch it because they're not familiar with Arduinos.
You're measuring SWR by getting the return voltage, right?
No, actually, this is a little different. No, I'm not measuring SWR. The problem with measuring SWR is that when you get close to being tuned, your reflected signal becomes so small, you're dealing with something that's hard to read, hard to measure. So I measure the voltage on the line and I measure the current on the line and look at the phase relationship between them and the amplitude relationship between them. So this is able to tune a very low SWR as well as a high VSWR. And that's one thing about it that's different.
How do you determine whether you need more inductance or more capacitance? How do you determine whether you're turning the roller inductor or the capacitor if you're using CMOS gates?
Yeah, then there's a lot of analog circuitry there as well. But you look at the phase angle. You look at the phase angle to control one of the variables, and you look at the amplitude to control the other variable. And the amplitude is the circuit is set up so that when you are looking at 50 ohms, the voltage and the current signals are equal in amplitude. So it just drives towards the equal amplitude and a phase angle of 0.
Well, I hope that you'll share that design with the listeners at some point, or you'll share it with the entire amateur radio community in an article for QST.
Yeah, I've published one article in QST, and I've got 3 more in there that they have accepted for publication, but haven't been published yet. One of them is for a time domain reflectometer that can be built for about $10. I don't know if they would be very interested in this automatic antenna tuner, because the article would have to be big enough, long enough that they would have a very, very hard time condensing it. And they like to condense the articles down to where they fit on 2 pages.
Maybe it's not QST, maybe it's QSX or the other journal is that goes into much more detail.
Then the audience becomes so much smaller. So I'm almost tempted, if I publish it, to just put it on our club's website and hope that people can find it there.
Well, Stan, if you let us know, we might have a little bit larger audience, and we'll be happy to let people know to come to the club's website so we can see that. I'm really interested in, I've got an old Heathkit automatic antenna tuner that has 2 big capacitors and a roller inductor in it. And I've thought of replacing the electronics with an Arduino controller. But I like the idea that you're suggesting here, so I myself could be an early fan and adopter of your design.
Oh, okay. I will try to remember that and keep track of your call and let you know how things progress.
Before we go, do you have any advice that you'd give to newer returning hams?
Yes, I would tell people, be curious, explore. Don't just buy an appliance and sit there and operate it. Tinker, experiment. People say to me, how should I build this antenna? And I say to them, put up what you think might work and see what happens. That's what's needed. This creative spark that comes from being curious and being willing to try things and see what works.
What's interesting about your response before I let you go, and that is that the response that you're giving, it sounds to me like it's based on your childhood experiments filtered through the Bell Labs. Yeah.
And John Deere.
What great advice. And I would urge the listeners, if they're not building, to build anything. That's what I love to do as well.
When you lose your curiosity, you start to die.
Well, fortunately for us, Stan, as amateur radio operators, there's so much to be curious about that we potentially could live forever.
Yes.
What a pleasure, Stan. Thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. 73.
It's my pleasure, and I hope that the stuff I've shared can inspire others to enjoy life through ham radio.
I think it will. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Stan. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W0SJ in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.